The crowd gathered long before noon, dust rising from restless boots as the town prepared its cruelest entertainment. They dragged Sarah to the fence post by the blacksmith's yard, tying her wrists tight with rough rope, her plain calico dress torn at the hem, her bonnet lost somewhere in the jeering crowd. She wasn't a thief, nor a liar, just a woman too plain, too quiet, too ordinary for men who thought beauty was the only coin a woman carried. "Not pretty enough for a mail-order bride," one man hollered, laughter sharp and ugly. "Let her stand there till someone's blind enough to claim her." Another waved a rusted pan in the air, mocking applause. The sheriff leaned against the saloon rail, saying nothing. He wasn't paid to stop jokes, just to clean up the pieces. Sarah kept her chin high, though her throat ached from holding back tears. She'd come west for a chance at a life, not this humiliation. But in this town, hope was just another thing they sold for laughs. Then, through the dust and jeers, a hush fell over the crowd. A lone rider approached, his black horse cutting through the heat like a shadow. He rode slow, steady, not rushed or bothered by the show. His face was half hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but the jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw caught the sunlight like a badge earned the hard way. Caleb Reed, the scarred rancher who spoke little and smiled less. Some called him broken, others called him dangerous, but today he was the only one who saw her. He dismounted without a word, boots hitting the earth with quiet finality. The crowd watched, waiting for him to join the laughter. Instead, Caleb walked to the fence, his hands calm and sure. Without asking permission, he untied the ropes from her wrists, the rough twine falling to the dirt. He removed his worn duster coat and draped it gently over her shoulders, covering the torn dress and bruised pride. Then, for the first time, he spoke, low, steady, meant for her alone. "No one ties what's already free." He turned to the crowd, his voice rising just enough to carry, "She's with me now." No laughter followed, just silence, a silence thicker than dust, heavier than heat. Caleb offered his hand, and Sarah took it with shaking fingers, stepping down from the fence not as a joke, but as a woman walking beside a man who saw what no one else dared to look for. And when they rode away, no one called her plain again. The plains stretched wide and quiet as they rode, the town's laughter fading behind them like smoke in the wind. Sarah sat behind Caleb on the black mare, the weight of his coat still heavy on her shoulders, but lighter than the shame she'd left tied to that fence. Neither spoke for miles. There was a comfort in the silence, a peace that words couldn't hold without breaking. Caleb rode steady, his scar catching the dying light, his posture straight but never stiff. He didn't glance back at the town. He didn't need to. He knew its cruelty by heart. As dusk settled, he slowed near a stream shaded by pines and dismounted, tying the horse loosely to a low branch. "Camp here," he said, voice rough but steady. "Too far to reach the ranch tonight." She slipped from the saddle awkwardly, her body sore from the ride, and the ropes that still burned faintly around her wrists. Caleb built a fire with the ease of a man who'd lived more nights beneath the stars than under a roof. He handed her a blanket and a tin of beans without fuss or question. They ate in quiet, the fire crackling between them. Finally, unable to bear the silence, Sarah asked, "Why did you help me?" He poked the fire with a stick, the embers glowing soft against his scarred cheek. "Because no one else did." She frowned, fingers curling around the blanket. "You don't even know me." He looked up then, his eyes steady and unreadable. "I don't need to. A woman tied like a dog doesn't deserve questions. She deserves a choice." The words hit harder than any laughter back in town. And what if I'd said no to leaving? She whispered. Caleb gave a faint smile, tired but true. Then I'd have untied you anyway. No one gets left chained. The wind stirred between them, cool and gentle. For the first time in days, Sarah felt her chest ease. She wasn't sure if this man was her savior or just a stranger with a scarred past of his own. But tonight, under a sky too wide for fear, she was simply free. As sleep crept close, she pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders, its worn warmth steady against the night. She didn't know where the road ahead led, but beside this quiet man, for the first time, she wanted to find out. And in the stillness of that fire-lit night, freedom no longer felt so far away. By midday the next day, the ranch appeared like a quiet promise against the horizon. Simple fences, a weathered barn, and a cabin leaning into the hills as if the earth itself was holding it upright. No grand welcome, no waiting crowd, just peace stretched wide across the land. Caleb dismounted first, tying the mare by the porch rail. He turned to help Sarah down, but paused, letting her decide. She slid off the horse herself, legs unsteady but her choice her own. He nodded once, approval in his quiet way. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke and dust, worn but cared for. A single chair by the fire, a rough-hewn table with 2 cups, and a narrow bed tucked beneath the window where sunlight streamed in soft and golden. Caleb dropped his saddlebag near the door and gestured toward the hearth. "There's stew in the pot. Eat first, rest later." She obeyed without protest. Hunger didn't leave much room for pride. As she ate, she watched him move about the cabin, checking the shutters, stacking kindling, pouring water into the cracked basin by the door. He moved like a man used to quiet, a man who'd lived long without company. But never once did he treat her like an intruder. After the meal, she stood by the window, staring out at the hills rolling far beyond the fences. "You live here alone?" she asked, her voice small against the silence. Caleb rested his hand on the doorframe, watching her reflection in the glass. "Haven't had reason not to." She turned, meeting his steady gaze. "And what am I to you now? A guest? A burden?" He stepped closer, not looming but steady. "Neither. You're someone the world tied up without asking if you wanted to fight back." Her throat tightened. No one had ever put it plain like that. "And now?" she whispered. He shrugged, simple and true. "Now you fight when you want to. Rest when you don't." That night, he rolled out his bedroll by the hearth, leaving the bed for her without discussion. She watched him settle, his back to the door, rifle close by. Not out of fear of her, but of what might still follow. Before the fire died low, she whispered into the dark, "Thank you." He didn't answer right away, but in the quiet, she heard him shift beneath the blankets, his voice soft but clear. "Ain't nothing owed for giving someone back their name." And as the night wrapped around the little cabin, Sarah drifted into sleep knowing that tomorrow she'd wake up not as a joke, but as a woman with a name worth keeping. Peace lasted 3 days before the dust rose on the ridge. Caleb spotted the riders first, their shadows long against the noonday sun. 4 men from town, spurs clinking, laughter sharp and hollow as they rode down the trail. Sarah stood frozen at the cabin door, fingers clenched in the fabric of Caleb's coat still hanging from her shoulders. "Stay inside," Caleb said, voice steady as iron. But she shook her head. "I won't hide." He didn't argue. He only stepped beside her, shoulder to shoulder, as the riders dismounted and fanned out before the porch. The leader, a man named Holt, with a sneer sharp enough to draw blood, spat into the dirt. "Heard you took something that wasn't yours, Reed. Thought we'd give you a chance to hand her back before this gets messy." Caleb didn't blink. No man owns what breathes on its own. Holt laughed, the others following like wolves. She was tied for the taking. You paid nothing for her. Caleb rested his hand near the rifle, leaning by the door. Paid more than any of you ever offered. Paid respect. The word fell like a stone in the dust. Holt's smile faded. He took a step forward. We ain't leaving without her. Sarah stepped down from the porch then, her voice cutting through the still air. I'm not leaving. Not with you. Not ever. The men blinked, as if the fence post they once tied her to had suddenly learned to speak. Holt's jaw clenched. This ain't over. Caleb finally smiled, small, cold, and true. It is for today. The men hesitated, the weight of Caleb's rifle and Sarah's steady gaze pinning them in place. Finally, Holt turned, mounting his horse in a flurry of dust. Enjoy your charity case, Reed. She won't fix what's broke in you. Caleb tipped his hat low. Don't need fixing when you've found peace. The riders left, their threats trailing behind like smoke in the wind. Sarah stood quiet beside him until the dust settled. They'll be back, she whispered. Caleb nodded. Probably. She looked up at him, heart steady for the first time in years. Then let them come. I'll be waiting too. He glanced at her then, something soft in his scarred face. You don't owe me a stand. She smiled faintly. Number, but I owe myself one. That night, as the fire crackled and the wind sang against the window, the cabin felt less like a hiding place and more like a home with two hearts strong enough to hold it upright. Days passed without trouble, but trouble always keeps time in the West. Sarah spent her mornings tending the garden patch Caleb had forgotten, coaxing stubborn roots from dry earth. He repaired the south fence, keeping one eye on the horizon, where dust might mean cattle or trouble. They spoke little, but not from distance. It was a quiet that built like trust between them. One evening, over black coffee and bread crisped on the stove, Caleb spoke first. You fixing to stay long? She wiped her hands on her skirt, meeting his eyes across the table. Would you ask me to leave? He shook his head, slow and certain. Not unless you asked me to. She smiled, small but honest. Then I reckon I'll stay till I find a reason not to. No one had ever given her the choice before. Not in the poorhouse. Not in the streets of Cheyenne. Not on the auction block where men laughed at her plain face like it was a crime. That night, she folded his duster coat and laid it on the chair. She no longer needed it to feel protected here. In the mornings, the porch became her sanctuary. She read from a tattered book Caleb found beneath the floorboards, its pages brittle, but its words alive. He sat beside her some evenings, sharpening his knife or mending a saddle strap, not speaking unless something true needed saying. And that was enough. But peace is loud in a place where violence feels forgotten. One morning, as she fetched water from the creek, she found tracks, boot prints, fresh. Caleb spotted them too when she returned, his jaw tightening, his scar catching the morning light. Town men? She asked. Maybe, he said, scanning the tree line. Or someone worse. He loaded the rifle, slow, methodical. Fear tickled the back of her throat, but she swallowed it down. If they come again? She asked. Caleb's voice didn't waver. We stand. Together? He looked at her then, steady and quiet. That's how it works now. And just like that, the fear lost some of its teeth. That night, before the lantern burned low, she spoke soft but sure. I was tied to a fence when you found me. Now I feel like I could build one to keep the world out. Caleb gave a rare smile, slow and steady. Then we'll build it tall. Beneath the hum of crickets and the sigh of wind through pine, Sarah finally believed it. This place, these days, this quiet. It was hers too. Not borrowed, not stolen, built. And the woman who once waited to be claimed now stood on her own land, beside a man who never asked her to be anything but herself. The smoke came at dawn, thin at first, curling over the ridge like a warning whispered by the wind. Caleb spotted it from the porch, his coffee forgotten on the rail. Sarah stood beside him, the knot in her stomach tightening. "Fire?" she asked, her voice low. Caleb shook his head once, slow and certain. "Campfire. Too controlled for wild brush. Men." He saddled the black mare without haste, but with purpose. "Stay close to the cabin. If trouble finds us, the barn's safer than the open yard." She crossed her arms. "You'll meet them alone?" He paused, tipping his hat lower. A man's quiet means more when it faces noise head-on. She didn't argue, but her hand rested on his arm a second longer than needed. "Come back." He gave a small, sure nod. Then he was gone, riding toward the smoke, his shadow stretching long in the morning light. Sarah watched until the ridge swallowed him. The hours dragged like heavy boots on stone. She prepared the cabin for what might come. Rifle loaded, shutters latched, food and water within reach. If this place was going to be called home, she'd defend it like one. By afternoon, hoofbeats returned, not rushed, not chased. Caleb rode in slow, his face unreadable. She met him halfway, heart thudding. "Well?" "Holt," he said simply. "And 3 others." Her mouth tightened. "What do they want?" Caleb dismounted, removing his hat, wiping dust from his brow. "Said they'd give me one last chance to send you back. Said they'd return tomorrow to hear my answer." She waited, pulse hammering in her throat. "And what did you tell them?" He looked at her, steady as a mountain against the wind. "Told them there's no answer they'll like." Silence stretched between them, thick but steady. She set her jaw. "Then tomorrow we stand." He gave a faint smile, pride flickering beneath his scar. "That's how it works now." They spent the rest of the day reinforcing the fences, hiding supplies in the root cellar, and oiling the rifle barrels. No panic, no despair, just work. The kind that builds resolve one nail at a time. That night, as they sat by the firelight, Sarah laid her hand over his. "They tied me to a fence like I was a thing to be owned. Tomorrow, I'll show them I'm not." Caleb squeezed her fingers gently. "And they'll learn I don't trade what's mine for anyone's laughter." Outside, the wind rose, carrying the scent of pine and distant smoke. But inside the cabin, quiet courage burned brighter than fear. The dawn broke cold and still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Caleb loaded the final round into his rifle, setting it beside the porch rail, where the rising sun caught the worn wood like a silent promise. Sarah stood by his side, her apron folded away, her hands steady. The wind carried dust before the riders arrived. 4 silhouettes crested the ridge, Holt and his men, faces shadowed beneath wide brims, rifles strapped across their backs. They came slow, confident, as if the world still turned to their will. Caleb stepped forward, calm as morning frost. "This is where it ends." Holt dismounted first, boots thudding against dry earth. "Didn't figure you'd be foolish enough to fight for what's already broken." Sarah stepped beside Caleb then, her voice clear as spring water. "I wasn't broken. I was waiting." Holt sneered, spitting at the dust between them. "For what? A scarred rancher with a dead ranch and a fence half built?" Caleb's voice stayed low but sharp. "A man's home ain't measured in fences. It's measured in what he protects." Holt laughed, but there was a crack in it. "Fine, let's take it then." He motioned to his men. Hands hovered near rifles. Sarah felt her heart pound, but her feet did not move. "Stop," she called, raising her voice for the first time since the auction square. "Take me if you must, but know this. You'll ride home with your hands stained by more than dust. You'll ride home having stolen what no man has a right to take. Choice." The men hesitated. Holt cursed beneath his breath. Caleb rested his hand near his rifle but did not lift it. "Last chance, Holt. Ride away with your pride, or lose more than you bargained for." The standoff stretched like a drawn string. And then, to Sarah's surprise, the youngest of Holt's men shifted in his saddle, eyes darting between Caleb's calm and Holt's rage. He turned his horse without a word. Another followed. Holt stared at them, fury boiling behind his eyes, but no orders came. Slowly, with a bitter scowl, he mounted his horse. "You'll regret this, Reed." Caleb tipped his hat. "I regret nothing that keeps peace in my yard." The riders turned, their dust trailing like ghosts across the ridge. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Caleb lowered his hand from the rifle, his shoulders easing for the first time in days. And beside him, Sarah smiled softly, not in relief, but in victory. Because this time she wasn't the one tied to the fence. She was the one standing beside the man who untied her, ready for whatever came next. The next morning brought stillness, not the uneasy quiet of fear, but the kind that follows a storm finally spent. Caleb stood by the south fence line, hammer in hand, staring at the crooked posts that Holt's men had threatened but never crossed. Sarah joined him, sleeves rolled up, a bucket of nails swinging from her hand. "You fixing to leave it broken?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. He gave a rare smile. "Never liked building fences alone." They worked side by side through the morning, hammering boards, tightening wire, mending what others had tried to tear down. Sweat streaked their brows, but neither complained. By midday, the last post stood straight and sure, casting a shadow over ground that once held only fear. Caleb leaned against the rail, wiping his brow. "Stronger than it was before." Sarah rested her arms on the top plank, looking out over the hills. "Funny how that works." They shared a quiet laugh, small but real. As the afternoon faded, a dust trail rose from the west. Sarah tensed, but Caleb rested a calming hand on her shoulder. "Not all riders bring trouble." A lone figure approached, a male rider, young and worn, who tipped his hat and handed Caleb a folded letter before riding off without a word. Caleb opened it slowly, his brow furrowing as he read. Sarah waited, heart caught between beats. He handed it to her without a word. The letter was from the preacher in town. It read simply, "The town's talking about what happened. Some call you foolish, others call you brave, but none can deny you've built something worth watching. If you ever want your vows spoken under a church roof instead of an open sky, my door's open." Sarah read the words twice, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. Caleb watched her, steady and sure. "Don't need a preacher to tell me what I already know," he said quietly, "but if it'd mean something to you." She folded the letter, tucking it into her apron pocket. "I think this fence says enough." They stood there as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the land they now called theirs. No crowd cheered, no papers marked the day. But in the quiet, they knew. This wasn't the end of their story. It was the middle of a life they built not from laughter or pity, but from standing firm when others expected them to fall. And as the breeze swept through the finished fence, Sarah smiled. The girl they once tied to a fence was now the woman who built one to keep her heart safe and open. It wasn't long before the town had to reckon with what they'd done. Market day came, and Sarah rode in beside Caleb, her chin lifted, her plain blue dress pressed clean, her hands steady on the reins. Heads turned as they passed. Men who once tied her to a fence now lowered their eyes, and women who had whispered behind cupped hands now watched in awkward silence. Caleb dismounted first, helping her down without a word, his scar catching the morning light, but his gaze soft on her alone. They walked together through the market square, side by side, without hurry. The sheriff tipped his hat, clearing his throat as if choking on old guilt. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon," he muttered. Sarah smiled, quiet but firm. "Didn't plan to stay gone long?" Holt stood further down, leaning against the feed store, arms crossed tight. He said nothing, but his glare burned across the square. Caleb met his eyes without flinching. No threats passed between them, just a silent understanding. This wasn't Holt's fight anymore. At the general store, Sarah traded eggs for flour, her voice calm and clear. When a young girl stared at her too long, wide-eyed and curious, Sarah knelt with a smile. "They called me plain once," she said softly. "But the prettiest thing in life is what you build with your own hands." The girl smiled back, shy but true. They left the town with their wagon full and their heads higher than when they came. No one stopped them. No one dared. Back at the ranch, as Caleb unloaded supplies, Sarah sat on the porch swing they built together, watching the horizon stretch far and free. "Think they'll ever see me as anything but the plain girl tied to a fence?" she asked. Caleb wiped his hands on his trousers, looking out at the fields they planted and the fence they mended. "I don't care what they see. I care what you are." She smiled, soft and grateful. "And what's that?" He stepped onto the porch beside her, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "Free." The word settled deep in her chest, heavier than chains but lighter than air. That night, as the crickets sang and the moon rose high, she rested her head against his shoulder, the steady beat of his heart more honest than any promise spoken by strangers. And for the first time, she knew it didn't matter what the town remembered. What mattered was what they built far beyond its reach. Seasons turned, and the wind softened across the hills of Caleb's ranch. Where there was once dust and fire, now wildflowers grew along the fence they had built together, their colors bold against the quiet earth. The laughter from the town faded into something distant, powerless against the life they made beyond its reach. Caleb worked the fields while Sarah tended the garden, their days steady, their nights filled with the soft crackle of the hearth and the easy silence that only true peace knows. Strangers still passed through from time to time, drifters, traders, and lost souls looking for a place that felt like something steady. Sarah greeted them all with a smile, not the timid kind she once wore, but the kind that said, "This land was fought for, and you'll find no shame here." One late autumn evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in gold, Caleb built a small wooden sign beside the fence, where the wind first carried her laughter home. Sarah watched from the porch, brow raised. "What's it say?" He wiped his hands on his jeans, stepping back. In rough, steady letters, it read, "Freedom's Hollow." She smiled, the wind tugging gently at her skirt. "Why name it that?" He met her gaze, steady and sure. "Because no man owns what lives here now. Not the land, not the love, not you." Tears burned her eyes, but they didn't fall. She walked to him, resting her head against his chest where his scarred hand came to rest without hesitation. "They tied me to a fence because they thought I was plain, but you untied me like I was worth the world." He kissed the top of her head, his voice low but certain. "You were never tied to begin with, just waiting for someone to cut the rope." They stood there, As the sky turned to dusk, the fields swaying in the breeze, the fence behind them no longer a prison, but a boundary they had chosen, together. In the quiet that followed, Sarah finally understood. It wasn't the town's laughter that defined her, nor the ropes they used to bind her. It was the choice she made every day to stand, to build, and to love without shame. And as the stars blinked into view, she smiled, knowing that no fence, no man, no scar, and no cruel word could ever hold her again. She was home, and home, at last, was free.